It was a morning like any other in Oakwood Heights, a quiet suburban neighborhood where peace seemed as constant as the rhythm of the rising sun. Daniel Walker, a civil engineer by day, was standing in his kitchen, half-finished cup of coffee in hand, still in his flannel robe and socks. He had barely been awake for 20 minutes, and already, the world outside his windows felt peaceful. It was a lifestyle they had longed for, a reprieve from the chaos of city life in San Diego, after years of high-pressure work. Daniel and his wife, Sarah, had decided to leave it all behind and start fresh in a planned community on the outskirts of the city. Their new home, a cozy craftsman at the end of a cul-de-sac, seemed to promise everything they had dreamed of: peace, quiet, and a chance to finally slow down. Sarah, with her dark hair pulled back and wearing her usual workout gear, appeared from the hallway, still half-closed in sleep but ready for the day. Her steady presence had always been one of the things Daniel loved about her. They had spent nearly a decade in the hustle of San Diego, but Oakwood Heights was meant to be their sanctuary, a place where they could reclaim their time, their lives, and maybe even find a little bit of normalcy. But normal was not what they were going to get. The loud banging on their front door shattered the quiet. It wasn't the kind of knock you'd expect from a neighbor dropping by or a solicitor looking for signatures. It was the kind of pounding you hear in cop shows. The kind of pounding meant to get your attention, to demand that you take notice. A quick glance at the clock told Daniel that it was barely 7 o'clock a.m. He froze, his mug still in hand, staring toward the door. The next series of knocks was even more forceful, as though someone was about to break the door down. Then came the voice, barking through the door with an urgency that sent a chill down his spine. "Daniel Walker, step outside now." The command was sharp, forceful, and enough to make Daniel's pulse race. His instincts told him to freeze, but his mind screamed at him to move. Sarah, now standing beside him, gave him a quizzical glance, silently asking, "What's going on?" Without thinking, Daniel placed his coffee mug on the counter and moved toward the door. Through the window beside it, he caught sight of what looked like a small army of men standing on his porch, all wearing dark tactical pants and black boots. Their navy blue shirts emblazoned with large white letters reading "HOA Inspector." The uniforms looked cheap, like something you'd get from a novelty shop online. Still, the way they stood, the way they had positioned themselves on the porch like they were preparing for some sort of raid, it didn't sit right. One man stood at the front, taller than the rest, his hand resting on the pistol at his side. Daniel could barely make out his face, but something about him felt oddly familiar. His heart sank as he recognized the man. It was Greg Morrison, their neighbor from across the street. The man who had seemed so friendly when they first moved in, who had helped Daniel fix a leaking pipe, who had invited them to his BBQ. The man who was now standing in front of his house in full tactical gear. Daniel opened the door just enough to keep the chain in place. His voice was steady, but his heart was pounding. "What's this about?" Greg's eyes locked on him, and his mouth twisted into a smug half-smile that made Daniel's stomach churn. "Step aside, sir," Greg said, his voice dripping with that false authority he loved to wield. "We have official reports of a code violation and a potential security breach. Your wife needs to come with us for questioning." Daniel blinked, trying to process what was happening. Questioning by the HOA. He couldn't quite wrap his head around it. Greg had never mentioned anything about having the power to arrest anyone, and Daniel certainly had never seen him in this kind of role before. Greg's smirk only widened. "Neighborhood safety isn't a joke, Mr. Walker. Now get her out here. We can do this the easy way or the hard way." Behind Greg, one of the men shifted nervously, his eyes darting toward the street as if looking for an escape route. Another glanced at the neighbor's windows, no doubt wondering if anyone was watching. Sarah stepped into view, her movements as calm as ever. She didn't say anything at first, just looked out at Greg and his crew. Her eyes were focused, sharp. "Do you have a warrant?" she asked, her voice steady, polite but firm. Greg paused for a second, his confidence slipping just a little. "What?" A search warrant. An arrest warrant. Sarah's voice didn't waver. Any legal documentation that authorizes you to be here. Greg hesitated. One of the men behind him coughed awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Daniel glanced at Sarah, who didn't even flinch. She was standing tall, her posture unshakable, as if she had dealt with situations like this before. Greg's face flushed red, his jaw tightening. "I don't need a piece of paper to keep this neighborhood safe," he said, his fingers brushing the pistol at his side. At that moment, Sarah's eyes narrowed, and Daniel could see the shift in her demeanor. She didn't just stand her ground. She became the one in control. Greg had no idea what he had just walked into. "Daniel," Sarah said without taking her eyes off Greg, "why don't you call the sheriff's office? Ask for the duty sergeant. Tell them we have 4 men impersonating officers on our front porch." Greg's face darkened, but Sarah wasn't done. "You're making a big mistake," he muttered, his voice filled with venom. "No, Greg," Sarah said calmly. "The mistake is yours." It was then that Daniel realized just how out of his depth he was. Whatever was going on here, whatever had driven Greg to show up on his doorstep like this, was much bigger than a simple neighborhood dispute. The next few moments were a blur. Sarah's calmness in the face of danger, her authority over the situation, began to dawn on Daniel. This wasn't just a neighbor issue. This was something calculated, something planned. Greg wasn't just a guy trying to enforce a neighborhood rule. He was part of something much darker, much more dangerous. As the confrontation continued, Daniel learned the truth about Sarah. She wasn't just a security consultant. She was the elected sheriff of their county, a law enforcement officer with 15 years of experience, someone with a much deeper connection to the law than Daniel had ever realized. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. His wife wasn't just some quiet, supportive partner. She had been keeping secrets, and now they were all coming to light. Sarah had been prepared for this. She wasn't just reacting to Greg's threats. She had been anticipating this, planning for it. It turned out that Greg wasn't just harassing them about the fence. He had been running a scam, working with a real estate investor to manipulate families into selling their homes for cheap. He wasn't alone, he had a network, and that network was now crumbling. Sarah dove into the investigation, using her access to law enforcement databases to dig into Greg's past. She uncovered the truth. Greg was not a cop. He wasn't even a licensed security guard. His real name was Gregory Mitchell, and his criminal history was extensive. He had been arrested multiple times for impersonating a police officer and for harassment. This wasn't just some petty neighborhood fight. This was a man who had been using his fake authority to manipulate and intimidate people for years. Sarah didn't just let it slide. She set a trap, hating Greg into making a mistake. When he tried to escalate the situation, she was ready. At a neighborhood meeting, with dozens of neighbors watching, Sarah turned the tables. She presented the evidence: Greg's fake badge, his involvement in illegal property dealings, his history of intimidation, and exposed him for the fraud he was. Greg tried to fight back, but the crowd had turned. The man who had once seemed so confident and powerful was now a criminal, a fraud, and everyone knew it. As Greg tried to draw a weapon, Sarah was quicker. In less than 3 seconds, she had disarmed him, restrained him, and had him arrested. The neighborhood, which had been fractured by fear, was suddenly united in relief. Greg's empire of lies had come crashing down, and Sarah was the one who had brought it to light. But the story didn't end there. Sarah's investigation had uncovered a much larger conspiracy, one involving real estate fraud, manipulation of military families, and a network of criminals operating under the radar. And Sarah was determined to take it down, piece by piece. The investigation continued for weeks, with Sarah working behind the scenes to gather evidence and track down the criminals involved. By the time the operation was over, Greg was behind bars, and Sarah had uncovered a massive network of criminals who had been exploiting families for years. In the end, the neighborhood was safer, the HOA was reformed, and Sarah had shown everyone just how much power one person could have when they refused to back down. But as the weeks went on, Daniel began to realize that even though the neighborhood was quiet again, the fight was far from over. Sarah's phone buzzed with a cryptic message, and he could see the shift in her eyes. The war against corruption, deception, and the forces that lurked in the shadows was just beginning. Sarah's victory in Oakwood Heights wasn't just about exposing a fraudulent HOA leader. It was about making sure that, in a world where power can be abused, there would always be someone standing in the way. And as long as she was there, that person would be Sarah Walker.